He came to the mountains to outrun memories that had the persistence of shadows, clinging to him long after the sun had set. For Elias Thorne, silence was not an absence of sound, but a different kind of noise, a low hum that had replaced the clamor of the world he left behind. The high peaks of the Appalachians offered a silence so profound it felt like a physical presence, a weight of clean air and old stone that might finally be heavy enough to press the ghosts flat. He was a man in his 40s, but the years were etched around his eyes in a fine web of vigilance, a map of all the things he had seen and could not unsee. His body was still a tool of his trade, lean and corded with the disciplined strength of a man who had spent 2 decades as a Navy SEAL. Movement was his meditation, a quiet economy of motion that wasted nothing, not a step, not a breath. He wore what amounted to a uniform of self-imposed exile. An olive M65 field jacket, its fabric softened by 1,000 rains and 100 campfires. A red and black plaid flannel shirt, faded cargo pants with pockets that held only the essentials, a compass, a folding knife, a Zippo that never failed. On his wrist, a military-issue watch ticked with relentless, unapologetic precision, a quiet tyrant measuring the passage of a life he was trying to let drift. His world had been reduced to the 35-pound weight of his Eberly stock half-track backpack and the steady, silent companionship of the dog who walked at his side. The dog was named Ghost. He was a German shepherd, a veteran himself, with a magnificent sable coat that was beginning to show distinguished threads of silver around his muzzle and eyes. He was not a pet. The relationship was deeper, more complex than that. Ghost had been his partner through 2 deployments, a 4-legged extension of his own senses, a silent interpreter of the unseen world. The dog moved with the same quiet purpose as the man, his paws making little sound on the carpet of pine needles. His gaze was never idle. He was always assessing, measuring, listening to frequencies Elias could not hear. There was an understanding between them that transcended words, a language of shared glances, subtle shifts in posture, the soft huff of breath that could mean anything from all clear to danger, close. Ghost was never entirely off duty, and for that, Elias was grateful. The dog's vigilance allowed his own to recede, just for a moment, letting the tight coil in his gut loosen by a single precious degree. Ghost was his anchor to the present, the living, breathing proof that not everything he had touched had turned to dust. They had been walking for 3 days, pushing deeper into a national forest so vast it seemed to swallow the sky. Elias pitched his small tent near a stream that cut a silver scar through the deep green of the woods. He worked with practiced efficiency, the motions ingrained by years of making a home in inhospitable places. As he hammered in the last stake, he glanced at Ghost. The dog was sitting a few feet away, observing him with an expression of stoic, faintly critical judgment. Elias felt the corner of his mouth twitch. He could almost hear the dog's internal monologue. The left corner is a half-inch too low. Acceptable for a civilian, perhaps. It was a familiar, comforting ritual, this imagined critique. It made the loneliness feel less like a void and more like a choice. The air grew cooler as evening bled across the sky, the temperature dropping with the sun. The sounds of the forest changed. The daytime chatter of birds giving way to the deeper thrum of crickets and the distant, mournful call of a whippoorwill. Elias built a small fire, the flames licking at the dry kindling with a hungry crackle. He sat on a log, watching the sparks spiral up into the deepening twilight, a brief constellation of his own making. The fire was a comfort, but it also cast long, dancing shadows that played tricks on the eyes. In the flicker, the trees sometimes took on human shapes, and the sigh of the wind through the pines could sound like a whispered name. The name. The one he never said aloud. Memory was not a gentle visitor. It came without warning, an ambush in the quiet moments. It was the smell of diesel and dust, the gut-wrenching lurch of a Chinook, the high, thin air of the Hindu Kush. It was the face of his friend, Jake, grinning at him a second before the world dissolved into a storm of fire and shrapnel. It was the choice he had made. Mission over man. The cold, hard logic of the calculus he had been trained to make. He had completed the objective. He had also left a part of his soul behind, buried under a pile of foreign rock and regret. He closed his eyes, his hand tightening into a fist. The flames of the campfire became the orange bloom of the explosion, the crackle of wood, the sharp report of enemy fire. He could feel the grit of sand in his teeth, the weight of his gear, the heavier weight of his failure. He had come here, to this immense, indifferent wilderness, to find a silence that could finally drown out the echoes of that day. He had come here to forget that he was a man who had followed his orders perfectly, and in doing so, had broken the only vow that truly mattered. He was pulled from the undertow of the past by a change in the air, a subtle shift in the rhythm of the night. He opened his eyes. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and the forest was utterly still. It was the kind of silence that had teeth. He looked at Ghost. The dog was on his feet, rigid, his head cocked. His ears were swiveled forward, and a low, almost inaudible rumble vibrated in his chest. It wasn't a growl of aggression, but of deep, canine concentration. He was listening to something Elias could not perceive, a disturbance in the ancient equilibrium of the woods. The dog's posture was a warning flare. Elias trusted Ghost's instincts more than he trusted his own. The dog had saved his life more than once by sensing the unseen, the faintest tremor of a pressure plate, the scent of an enemy hiding in plain sight. Elias slowly got to his feet, his hand resting on the handle of the knife on his belt. He scanned the dark wall of trees surrounding their small camp. He saw nothing, heard nothing but the faint whisper of the breeze. But Ghost remained a statue of tense alertness, his black nose twitching, pointed north, deeper into the forest. Something was out there. Something was wrong. The next morning the unease lingered like the mist clinging to the valley floor. Elias broke camp with the first light, his movements swift and silent. He had intended to follow the stream west, but Ghost was insistent. The dog kept looking north, then back at Elias, a clear and repeated command. After a moment of hesitation, Elias relented. "All right, lead on," he murmured, his voice a rough whisper in the quiet air. He adjusted the straps of his pack and followed the shepherd as he trotted purposefully away from the water, pushing through dense thickets of rhododendron and up a steep, pine-covered ridge. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The farther they went, the more the landscape seemed to change. The trees grew older, their trunks thicker, their branches forming a dense canopy that cast the forest floor in a perpetual twilight. There was a feeling of forgottenness here, a sense that this part of the woods had been left undisturbed for a very long time. Ghost did not hesitate. He moved with the certainty of a creature following a scent trail laid down decades ago, a ghost story only he could read. After an hour of hard climbing, Ghost stopped. He stood at the base of a massive, unnaturally shaped mound of earth. It was long and wide, covered in a thick blanket of moss, ferns, and even a few small saplings. It looked like a natural feature, a hillock shaped by time and weather, but something about its symmetry felt wrong. Ghost began to whine, a low, anxious sound. He paced back and forth at the base of the mound, his nose pressed to the ground. Then, he began to dig. His powerful front paws threw clumps of dark soil and moss into the air. He worked with a frantic, obsessive energy that was unlike his usual disciplined demeanor. Elias watched him for a moment, a knot of curiosity tightening in his stomach. He unslung his pack and pulled out his entrenching tool, the small, foldable shovel of familiar weight in his hands. "Easy, boy," he said, walking over to the dog. "Let me see." Ghost backed away but remained close, panting, his eyes fixed on the spot. Elias knelt and began to clear the area Ghost had indicated. The shovel bit into the soft, loamy earth. A few inches down, it struck something hard with a dull, metallic thunk. It was not the sound of rock. It was the sound of steel. Elias worked methodically, his training kicking in. He widened the hole, clearing away the dirt and roots that had claimed this object for the better part of a century. The shape began to reveal itself slowly, an angular, unyielding form beneath the skin of the earth. First, a flat plate of rusted metal, then a thick, articulated band of interlocking pieces. He scraped away the caked mud and stood back, his breath catching in his throat. It was a track link, a piece of a tank, a very old tank. His heart began to pound a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He looked at the mound again, his eyes tracing its outline. It wasn't a hill, it was a vehicle. A massive armored vehicle, buried by time. He spent the rest of the day excavating, his movements fueled by a surge of adrenaline and a burning need to understand. He uncovered a section of the track, the huge road wheels, the angled side of a hull. The steel was pitted and scarred with rust, but it was unmistakably military. By late afternoon, he had cleared enough of the front glacis plate to see the distinctive rounded shape of the cast hull. It was an M4 Sherman, a workhorse of the Second World War. Here, in the middle of a forest, hundreds of miles from any known battlefield, lay a sleeping giant. The tank was buried at a slight angle, its nose dug into the slope of the ridge, as if it had tried to climb it and failed. The earth and forest had then spent the next 70-plus years slowly swallowing it whole. He ran his hand over the cold, rough steel. The texture was like petrified history. He felt a strange sense of reverence, of standing in the presence of something that held a story. He circled the exposed section, his eyes scanning for details. He found the commander's hatch on the turret, a thick circle of steel sealed shut by rust and time. He tried to force it, his muscles straining against the corrosion, but it wouldn't budge. He noticed something else. The gun barrel was gone, cut cleanly from the mantlet. The bow machine gun had also been removed. It hadn't just been abandoned. It had been demilitarized, stripped of its teeth before being left to the woods. Why? Why go to the trouble of disabling it, only to leave it here? It didn't make sense. It felt intentional, like a burial, a secret being deliberately hidden. The discovery shifted something inside him. The fog of his own past began to recede, replaced by the sharp focus of a new mission. This was a puzzle, a mystery dropped into the heart of his solitude, and every instinct he possessed screamed at him to solve it. He needed information. He needed context. He packed a small day pack, leaving his main camp set up near the buried tank. Ghost, his duty as a discoverer done, now assumed the role of guardian. He lay near the exposed hull, his head on his paws, but his eyes were alert, watching his master prepare to leave. "I'll be back, boy," Elias said, stroking the dog's head. "You hold the fort." He gave Ghost a final look, a silent acknowledgement of the strange and profound thing the dog had led him to. Then he turned and began the long hike back toward civilization. The image of the sleeping iron giant burned into his mind. The nearest town was a place called Harmony Creek, a small cluster of buildings nestled in a valley that looked as if it hadn't changed much since the Sherman was built. It had a single main street with a gas station, a diner, and a stately brick building with the words Caldwell County Courthouse etched above the door. The air here was different. thick with the smell of cut grass and car exhaust, a stark contrast to the clean, wild scent of the high country. Elias felt exposed, out of place. The few people he passed on the street gave him a wide berth, their eyes lingering on his rugged appearance, the hard set of his jaw. He was an anomaly here, a piece of the wilderness that had wandered into town. He walked into the courthouse, the sound of his worn leather boots echoing on the polished linoleum floors. He found the county clerk's office, a large room filled with the quiet rustle of paper and the musty, sweet smell of old books. Behind a wide oak counter sat a woman who looked as though she were carved from the same hardwood. She was in her late 50s, tall and spare, with sharp blue eyes and gray hair pulled back in a severe bun. A small engraved nameplate on the counter read, "Martha Riley, County Clerk." Elias approached the counter. "Ma'am," he said, his voice quiet. Martha Riley looked up from a thick ledger, her gaze sharp and appraising. She took in his field jacket, the faint lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the way he stood with a stillness that was not entirely relaxed. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone professional, laced with a healthy dose of rural skepticism. "I'm looking for old maps of the area," Elias began, choosing his words carefully. "Specifically, survey maps of the National Forest land, north of the Blackwater Ridge. From the 1940s, if you have them." Her eyebrows rose a fraction of an inch. It was not a typical request. "That's federal land. Most of those records would be with the National Archives. What we have here is mostly property deeds, tax rolls." "I understand," Elias said. "But sometimes the county did its own surveys. Or there might be records of land transfers, military use agreements, anything from around the Second World War." He didn't know why, but he felt he could trust this woman. There was a no-nonsense integrity about her that reminded him of a few good master chiefs he had known. Martha Riley studied him for a long moment, her blue eyes seeming to weigh and measure him. She saw not just a drifter, but a man with a purpose. She saw the discipline in his posture, the intelligence in his gaze. "What exactly are you looking for out there?" she asked, her voice softening slightly. Elias hesitated. He could not just say, "I found a tank." It sounded insane. "I'm a historian," he lied, the word feeling foreign in his mouth. "A researcher. I have reason to believe there was an unregistered military training site in that area." The lie was close enough to the truth. He was researching something now. Her expression didn't change, but he saw a flicker of understanding in her eyes. She nodded slowly. "The war touched everywhere, even here," she said almost to herself. She turned and disappeared into a back room filled with towering shelves of bound volumes and map tubes. Elias waited, the silence of the room pressing in on him. He could feel the weight of all the stories contained in those files, the countless lives documented in faded ink and brittle paper. Martha returned a few minutes later, blowing a thin layer of dust off a long, rolled-up tube of canvas. "Let's see what we've got," she said, unrolling it on the wide counter. It was a detailed topographical map of the county, dated 1942. Her long, slender finger traced a path across the paper, moving north from the town into the green-shaded expanse of the National Forest. "Most of this was just wilderness back then," she said. "But here—" Her finger stopped. She tapped a large rectangular area that had been marked off with a faint red line. Inside the box, in small, almost illegible script, were the words, "Whispering Pines Maneuver Area, U.S. Army, Restricted." Elias leaned closer, his heart quickening. It was real. "It was never officially decommissioned," Martha said, her voice low. "The war ended, the army packed up and left, and the forest just took it back. It was forgotten. Most people around here don't even know it existed. She looked up at him. There are stories, of course. Old-timers used to talk about the noise, the ground shaking, accidents. She rolled the map back up. If you really want to know about that place, there's one person you should talk to. Samuel Finch. He's our local historian, lives just outside of town, knows more about this county's secrets than anyone. She wrote an address on a small slip of paper and pushed it across the counter. Be warned, she added with a thin smile. Once you get him started, he doesn't stop. Samuel Finch lived in a small, cluttered house overflowing with books, maps, and artifacts. He was a man in his late 70s, with a cloud of white hair and eyes that lit up with an almost boyish enthusiasm when Elias explained why he was there. "A Sherman! You found a Sherman!" Finch exclaimed, slapping his knee. "I knew it. I knew there was still one out there." He scurried over to a wall covered in maps and photographs. "They called it the Whispering Pines Maneuver Area," he said, his voice filled with passion. "A place to train armored divisions before shipping them to Europe and the Pacific. They ran drills here day and night. It was our own little piece of the war." He pulled down a framed photograph of a line of Sherman tanks, young soldiers in fatigues sitting on their hulls, grinning for the camera. But it was a rushed job. The terrain was unforgiving, the equipment was often new, and the men were green. There were accidents, a lot of them. And the Army, well, the Army didn't like to advertise its mistakes. Things were covered up, reports were sanitized, men were shipped out. The official history is squeaky clean. Elias listened, absorbing every word. "I saw that the gun had been cut," he said. Finch nodded grimly. "Standard procedure for a vehicle that was being written off. They'd disable the main armament so it couldn't be used again. But to leave it there, that's the strange part. They usually hauled them out for scrap. Leaving one behind suggests something happened that they wanted to disappear. Quickly." He looked at Elias, his expression turning serious. "There was one story in particular. A crew was lost. A young sergeant was blamed for it, disobeying a direct order, reckless endangerment. He was court-martialed, dishonorably discharged. His career, his life, ruined. But the rumor was always that he was the scapegoat, that the real fault lay with the captain, a man from a wealthy, influential family who gave a foolish order and then buried his mistake along with the evidence." Samuel's voice dropped. "They say the tank itself was the key, that something inside it could prove the boy's innocence." A cold certainty settled over Elias. He knew, with an instinct that went beyond logic, that this was the tank. The story of the scapegoated sergeant resonated with his own history of failure and consequence. He had to get inside. He thanked Samuel for his time and information, promising to keep him updated. The historian gripped his arm. "Be careful," he said. "History isn't always dead. Sometimes it's just sleeping, and it doesn't always like to be woken up." The words hung in the air as Elias walked away, a premonition he couldn't shake. He drove his truck back to the trailhead, his mind racing. The puzzle was no longer just about a forgotten piece of military hardware. It was about a forgotten injustice. It was about a man whose name had been erased, whose honor had been stolen. It was a mission of recovery, not of steel, but of truth. It took him the better part of the next day to get the hatch open. He used a crowbar and a small sledgehammer he'd brought from his truck, working with patient, controlled force. The rust fought him every inch of the way, groaning and screeching in protest. Ghost sat nearby, a stoic sentinel watching the struggle. Finally, with a deafening shriek of tortured metal, the hatch broke free. It swung open on its heavy hinges, revealing a dark, square hole that smelled of stale air, oil, and something else. Time. He shone his flashlight into the darkness. The interior was remarkably preserved, a metal cocoon shielded from the elements for over 70 years. He lowered himself down into the commander's seat, his boots landing softly on the steel floor. The air was thick and cold. Dust motes danced in the beam of his flashlight like tiny, silent ghosts. It was a time capsule. He could see the driver's station, the gunner's controls, the radio set. Everything was coated in a fine layer of dust, but otherwise intact. His light swept across the small, cramped space. He imagined the crew, the young men who lived and fought in this steel beast, their jokes, their fears, the smell of sweat and cigarettes. He felt like an intruder in a sacred space. Tucked into a leather map case near the radio operator's position, he saw the corner of a metal box. It was a standard-issue Army document box, about the size of a shoebox, painted olive drab. His breath hitched. He carefully pulled it out. It was heavy. The latch was stiff, but he managed to work it open. Inside, nestled in yellowed cotton batting, were 3 items. A photograph, a stack of papers bound with a crumbling rubber band, and a thick, sealed envelope. He picked up the photograph first. It showed 2 young men in uniform, their arms slung around each other's shoulders, squinting in the sun. They were barely out of their teens, their faces full of the unshakable confidence of youth. One of them was impossibly handsome, with a movie star smile. The other was more serious, with kind eyes and a thoughtful expression. He then picked up the stack of papers. It was a field report, the official account of a training accident. He scanned the dry, bureaucratic language. It detailed how a tank, commanded by Sergeant Daniel Peterson, had overturned during a night maneuver, resulting in the death of the driver, Corporal Michael Lanning. The report concluded that the accident was due to Sergeant Peterson's gross negligence and his failure to follow the established route. It was signed by Captain Arthur Sterling. Elias felt a chill crawl up his spine. Sterling. The name from the historian's story. Finally, he picked up the envelope. The paper was thick and brittle with age. On the front, written in a neat cursive hand, were the words, "To my dearest Clara." It was a letter. He knew he was crossing a line, prying into a moment of profound intimacy, but he also knew he had to. This was the heart of the secret. With trembling fingers, he carefully broke the seal and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. The letter was dated June 10th, 1944. "My dearest Clara," it began. "If you are reading this, it means the worst has happened, and the Army's version of the story is the only one being told. I need you to know the truth. Mike is gone. He died last night, and they are blaming me. We were on a night drill. Captain Sterling ordered us to take a shortcut across the ravine. I told him it was too steep, that the ground was soft from the rains. He called me a coward. He said he'd have my stripes if I didn't move out. So I did. I followed his order. The ground gave way just as I feared. The tank went over. Mike, he was trapped. It wasn't my fault, Clara. I swear it on my love for you. The captain is burying his mistake by burying me. This report he's written is a lie. I have the real one, the one I wrote before he confiscated it, hidden with this letter. It shows the route he ordered us to take. It will prove my innocence. Don't let them forget Mike, and don't let them dishonor my name. All my love, forever. Your Danny." Elias's hand was shaking as he finished reading. He looked at the photograph again. Danny and Mike, the serious one and the smiling one. Boys sent to die not by an enemy, but by the arrogance of their own commander. Tucked behind the letter was another folded document. It was Danny's original report, complete with a hand-drawn map showing the treacherous route ordered by Captain Sterling. It was the truth, hidden away in a steel tomb for nearly 80 years, waiting for someone to find it. If this chapter stirred something in you, if the discovery of this long-buried truth reminds you of the importance of honor and the quiet strength it takes to stand for what is right, even when no one is watching, then please take a moment to like this story and share it with others.
Your engagement helps us continue to bring these narratives of faith, loyalty, and quiet courage to light. Leave a comment below telling us what loyalty means to you. And please, subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the rest of this incredible journey. Sometimes, the Lord doesn't ask us to move mountains. Sometimes, He just asks us to stay and listen to the stories they've been hiding. Elias sat in the silence of the tank for a long time, the letter in his hand. The weight of it was immense, far heavier than the paper it was written on. It was the weight of a ruined life, a stolen legacy, an uncorrected injustice. He felt a profound connection to Sergeant Daniel Peterson, a man he had never met, separated by generations, but united by the common experience of a moment that changes everything. He had his own Captain Sterling, his own fatal order, his own buried truth. But Danny had tried to fight back. He had preserved the evidence, holding on to a sliver of hope that the truth would one day surface. Elias had simply run away. He carefully placed the letter and the reports back in the metal box. He climbed out of the tank, emerging from the cold, dark past into the warm, living present. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the forest floor. He knew what he had to do. This was no longer about his own escape. It was about fulfilling the last wish of a dead soldier. It was about redemption. Not just for Danny, but perhaps, in some small way, for himself. He was securing the hatch for the night when he heard it. A sound that did not belong in the forest. The crunch of tires on a gravel road that wasn't on any map he had seen. Ghost heard it too. The dog rose to his feet, a low growl rumbling in his chest, the fur along his spine bristling. Elias motioned for him to be silent. He moved to the edge of the ridge, peering down through the trees. A black, late-model SUV was parked on a barely visible service road about 100 yards below. A man climbed out. He was in his late 40s or early 50s, dressed in expensive-looking chinos, a pressed blue shirt, and a tailored blazer. He moved with an air of casual ownership, as if the entire forest belonged to him. He looked up the ridge, his eyes scanning the trees, a pair of binoculars in his hand. His gaze seemed to pass right over Elias's position, but there was an unnerving certainty to his search. He was looking for something. He was looking for the tank. Elias felt a cold dread seep into his bones. This was too much of a coincidence. The man's arrival, so soon after his own discovery, felt orchestrated. He pulled back from the edge of the ridge, his mind racing. Who was this man? How did he know about the tank? The words of the historian Samuel Finch came back to him. A captain, a man from a wealthy, influential family. Sterling. He looked at the man below again. He saw the same confident, arrogant set to his jaw that he had seen in old black-and-white photographs of powerful men. This had to be a descendant, a son or a grandson protecting the family's dark secret. The man below raised a phone to his ear, spoke briefly, then got back into his vehicle and drove away, the sound of the engine fading into the evening quiet. The encounter left Elias with a profound sense of foreboding. The polite, well-dressed man was more dangerous than a dozen armed combatants. He represented a different kind of enemy, one who fought with lawyers, money, and influence. An enemy who could make things, and people, disappear. The next day, the man returned. This time he walked up the ridge, following the path of disturbed earth Elias had made. He moved with an unhurried, confident stride.
Elias stood his ground, waiting for him by the exposed hull of the tank. Ghost was at his side, a silent, menacing presence. The dog did not bark or snarl, but his body was coiled like a spring, his amber eyes locked on the approaching figure. The man stopped about 10 feet away, a polite, disarming smile on his face. "Quite a find," he said, his voice smooth and cultured. He gestured toward the tank. "An M4A3E8, a late war model. You have a good eye." Elias said nothing. He simply stood there, a granite obstacle in the man's path. The man's smile didn't falter. He extended a hand. "Richard Sterling," he said. "I'm with the Sterling Historical Preservation Foundation. We've been looking for this vehicle for some time." Elias ignored the outstretched hand. The name hit him like a physical blow. Sterling. He kept his face a mask of neutrality, but inside, his world tilted on its axis. "You're a long way from any road," Elias said, his voice flat. "This is a pretty remote area to be searching." Sterling chuckled, lowering his hand. "We had reason to believe one of our family's historical assets was located in this quadrant. My grandfather served in this area during the war. He commanded an armored unit. This tank was part of his command." He delivered the lines with practiced ease, as if he were a museum curator discussing a painting. He was laying claim to it, wrapping his personal history around it like a shroud. "The Foundation has the necessary permits from the state and the Forest Service to recover and restore the vehicle," Sterling continued, his tone becoming more businesslike. "We'll be bringing a team in tomorrow to begin the extraction." "This is a historical site," Elias said, his voice low and steady. "It should be documented, studied, not just hauled away." Sterling's smile tightened at the edges. The politeness was a thin veneer over something hard and unyielding. "Our foundation is perfectly capable of documenting it," he said coolly. "This is a private matter, a piece of family history we wish to reclaim. Frankly, it's a miracle some hiker like you didn't stumble on it sooner. We're prepared to offer you a finder's fee, of course, for your trouble. A thank you for locating it for us." The offer was an insult, a clear attempt to buy his silence, to dismiss him as a mere inconvenience. He was trying to reduce the monumental injustice Elias had uncovered to a simple transaction. "I'm not interested in your money," Elias said. Sterling's eyes narrowed. The mask of civility slipped for a fraction of a second. "I'm not sure you understand the situation," he said, his voice losing its warmth. "We have the legal authority. You are trespassing on what is effectively our recovery site. I could have the sheriff remove you." It was a threat, wrapped in the language of bureaucracy. Elias felt a familiar, cold anger rising within him. He had faced down men like Sterling before, men who believed their wealth and influence made them untouchable. He thought of the letter in his pack, of Danny Peterson's plea. He thought of Mike Lanning, dead in the dark. "You're not taking this tank," Elias said. It was not a request. It was a statement of fact. At that moment, Ghost, who had been silent and still, took one step forward. A low, guttural growl escaped his throat, a sound that seemed to come from the very earth itself. It was a clear, definitive warning. The dog's lips curled back just enough to reveal the tips of his long, white canines. Sterling took an involuntary step back, his composure finally cracking. His eyes darted from the dog to Elias, and for the first time, he looked uncertain. He saw not just a man and his dog, but a unified, immovable force. "I would advise you to control your animal," Sterling said, his voice tight with anger and a hint of fear. "And I would advise you to reconsider your position. My team will be here tomorrow morning, with or without your cooperation."
He turned without another word and walked back down the ridge, his confident stride now stiff and hurried. Elias watched him go, his hand resting on Ghost's head, the dog's low growl slowly subsiding. The battle lines had been drawn. It was not going to be a fight of guns and fists, but of will and conviction.
And it was a fight Elias knew he could not afford to lose. The sky that night was a bruised purple, the clouds heavy and ominous. A storm was rolling in, the air thick with the smell of rain and ozone. The wind began to pick up, whispering through the pines with a mournful sound. It felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting for the coming conflict. Elias didn't sleep. He sat with his back against the cold steel of the tank, the document box resting on his lap. He had made a call on his satellite phone, a brief, cryptic conversation with Martha Riley, the county clerk. He had told her only that a private party was attempting to remove a significant historical artifact from federal land and that he had evidence of its importance. She had listened without interruption and promised to look into it. He didn't know if she would or could do anything, but it was the only move he had. He spent the night in a state of heightened vigilance, every snap of a twig, every rustle of a leaf, setting his nerves on edge. Ghost lay at his feet, a warm, solid presence in the darkness, his breathing the only steady rhythm in a world about to break apart. They came just after dawn. 2 large trucks, one a flatbed carrying a small mobile crane, rumbled up the service road. Sterling was there, directing a team of 4 men. They were rough-looking, dressed in work clothes, their movements efficient and detached. One of them, a younger man with the unmistakable bearing of a former soldier, caught Elias's eye for a moment. There was a look of reluctance, of conflict, in his gaze before he looked away. Sterling saw Elias standing by the tank and strode toward him, his face a mask of grim determination. The pretense of politeness was gone. "This is your last chance to walk away," Sterling said, his voice sharp. "Don't be a fool." "This tank stays here," Elias replied, his voice calm, but his body was thrumming with tension. He stood directly in the path of the crew. Sterling scoffed. "You can't stop this." He turned to his men. "Get the chains on it. Let's get this done before the storm hits." The crew moved forward. Elias didn't move. He was 1 man against 5, an impossible standoff. But he was not trying to win a fight. He was trying to buy time. As the men approached, Ghost moved to stand in front of him, planting his feet, his body a solid wall of fur and muscle. He let out a single deep bark that echoed through the forest. The men hesitated, their eyes on the dog. They were professionals, but none of them wanted to tangle with 100 pounds of angry shepherd. "Get that dog out of the way," Sterling yelled. At that moment, the storm broke. The sky opened up, and rain began to fall in thick, slanting sheets. The wind howled through the trees, tearing at their clothes, its roar almost drowning out Sterling's voice. The forest floor quickly turned to mud. The conditions were becoming dangerous. The crane operator, a heavy-set man with a worried look, glanced at Sterling. "Boss, this is getting bad. The ground's getting soft." "I don't care," Sterling screamed over the wind. "Get it done!" The crew, spurred by Sterling's fury, began to work frantically. They attached heavy chains to the tank's towing points. The crane's engine roared to life, and the boom began to rise, its hook swinging in the gusting wind. Ghost stayed by Elias's side, barking, his senses overwhelmed by the noise and chaos. Elias stood his ground, his eyes locked on Sterling, who was watching the operation with a manic intensity. The crane hook, a massive piece of steel, was being lowered toward the tank. A sudden, violent gust of wind, stronger than the rest, ripped through the clearing. It caught the hook and the heavy length of chain, swinging it like a giant pendulum. It was moving impossibly fast, a blur of deadly metal arcing directly toward the side of the tank, directly toward Ghost. Time seemed to slow down. Elias saw the arc of the chain. He saw Ghost, standing his ground, loyal to the last, focused on the men he perceived as a threat. And in that split second, the past and present collided with the force of a physical impact. He was back in the mountains of Afghanistan. The smell of cordite, the shouting, the impossible choice. He saw Jake, trapped, reaching a hand out to him. He saw himself turn away, prioritizing the mission, securing the intel, following the cold logic that had been drilled into him. The logic that had won the engagement and cost him his soul. He looked at the document box in his hand, the letter, the proof, the mission. Protecting it was the reason he was here. It was his chance to right a wrong, to finally do something that mattered. But then he looked at Ghost, his partner, his only friend, the one living thing that had walked into the darkness with him and never flinched. The chain was a heartbeat away. He made a different choice. Without a second thought, he dropped the box. It fell into the mud with a wet thud. The mission could wait. The truth could wait. Loyalty could not. "Ghost!" he yelled, his voice a raw, desperate roar that cut through the storm. He launched himself forward, a desperate flying tackle. He hit the dog with his full weight, knocking him off his feet, the two of them tumbling through the mud and wet leaves. An instant later, there was a sickening metallic crash. The heavy chain smashed into the side of the tank with incredible force, right where Ghost had been standing. The impact sent a shudder through the ground. The steel of the hull was dented, a deep scar carved into the old iron. Elias lay on the ground, his arms wrapped around Ghost, shielding him with his own body. The dog was whining, confused, but unharmed. Elias held him tight, his face pressed into the dog's wet fur, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had chosen his partner. He had chosen to stay. This time, he had not turned away. The chaotic scene was frozen for a moment. Everyone stared at the dent in the tank, at Elias on the ground, clutching his dog. The raw, violent power of the near miss had shocked them all into stillness. The young crewman, the one with the soldier's eyes, looked from Elias to Sterling. He saw the cold fury on Sterling's face, a man enraged that his prize had been damaged, not the relief of a near-fatal accident being averted. He saw Elias, a man who had been willing to sacrifice everything to save his companion. And in that moment, the young man's conflict resolved. He walked over to the crane's hydraulic controls and, with a swift, deliberate movement, hit the emergency shutoff. Then he pulled a key component, a hydraulic valve, and tossed it into the dense undergrowth. "It's busted," he said, his voice flat, looking directly at Sterling. "Safety failure. We're done here. It's too dangerous." Before Sterling could react, another sound cut through the storm, the wail of a siren growing closer. Two vehicles appeared at the bottom of the ridge, a sheriff's department SUV and Martha Riley's sensible sedan. She and Samuel Finch got out, wrapped in raincoats, their faces grim and determined. Martha held up a piece of paper, a stop work order, protected from the rain in a plastic sleeve. "Richard Sterling," she called out, her voice carrying an authority that defied the storm. "By order of the Caldwell County Court, this site is now a protected historical area pending federal review. You and your men will cease all activity and vacate the premises immediately." Sterling's face contorted in a mask of pure rage. He was trapped. His plan had unraveled, thwarted by a stubborn veteran, a loyal dog, a conflicted worker, and a county clerk who believed in the rules. He looked at Elias, his eyes filled with a hatred that was almost pure. But there was nothing he could do. The law had arrived. The secret was out.
His power, built on money and influence, had been broken by a simple act of integrity. The morning after the storm was unnaturally quiet. The air was washed clean, and the sun shone through the dripping trees, making the forest glitter.
The chaos of the previous day was gone. In its place were two vehicles from the U.S. Army Center of Military History. A small team of uniformed historians, led by a thoughtful-looking colonel, was carefully surveying the site, working with Samuel Finch, who was practically vibrating with excitement. The tank was now cordoned off with official-looking tape. It was no longer a forgotten relic, but a monument. Richard Sterling was nowhere to be seen. Martha Riley had told Elias that he was facing a host of federal charges, from tampering with a historical site to attempting to destroy evidence. The Sterling family name, so carefully protected for generations, was now attached to a scandal that was beginning to make national news. The truth, once buried, was now free. Elias sat on a log, cleaning the mud from Ghost's coat with a damp cloth. The dog leaned against him, content and calm. His own past felt distant, the edges blurred. The constant low-grade hum of anxiety in his chest was gone. In its place was a quiet stillness he hadn't felt in years. He heard a car door shut down on the service road. He looked up to see a woman walking toward him. She was tall, with his same dark hair, though hers was cut shorter. It was his sister, Sarah. He hadn't seen her in 2 years. He had called her from his satellite phone after the authorities had secured the site, the first time he had initiated a call in longer than he could remember. She stopped a few feet away, her eyes taking in the scene, the tank, the soldiers, him. Her expression was a mixture of concern and relief. "You called," she said softly. It was not an accusation, but a simple, wondrous fact. "I did," he replied, his voice a little rough. He stood up. For a moment they just looked at each other, the years of silence and distance hanging between them. Then, she closed the distance and wrapped her arms around him. He was stiff at first, unused to the contact, but then he relaxed and hugged her back, his eyes closing. It was an anchor, a connection he thought he had severed forever. A few weeks later, the story of Sergeant Daniel Peterson and Corporal Michael Lanning was told in full. The Army officially exonerated Danny, posthumously restoring his rank and honor. They found his descendants, a granddaughter and great-grandchildren living in Ohio. They were flown in for a small, dignified ceremony at the site. The historian Samuel Finch read Danny's letter aloud. The granddaughter, a woman in her 60s with her grandfather's kind eyes, wept as she accepted the folded flag and the metal box containing the proof of his integrity. Elias stood at the back of the small crowd, Ghost at his side. He watched as Danny's family was finally given the truth. He felt a sense of closure that was profound and deeply peaceful. He had not just unearthed a tank. He had restored a man's name, healed a wound that had festered for generations. He had completed Danny's mission. Elias chose not to leave. The mountains no longer felt like a place of exile, but a place of purpose. He accepted a volunteer position with the county's search and rescue team, a role Martha Riley had suggested. His skills, honed in war, could now be used to save lives, to bring people home. He bought a small, rustic cabin on a few acres of land bordering the national forest. It had a porch that looked out over the same peaks he had once used to hide from the world. He was still a quiet man. He still wore his olive field jacket and his worn leather boots. But something fundamental had shifted inside him. He no longer looked at his reflection and saw only failure. He saw a man who had been given a second chance and had been strong enough to take it. He had faced his past, not by outrunning it, but by choosing to stand his ground and do the right thing right here. One crisp autumn evening, Elias stood on a ridge overlooking the valley. Ghost sat beside him, his aging body pressed against Elias's leg. In the distance, a small, permanent marker had been placed at the site of the tank, which was now a registered historical landmark, forever protected. The Iron Giant was at rest, its story finally told. The silence that surrounded them was no longer a void. It was full. It was filled with the rustle of leaves, the call of a distant owl, the steady beat of his own heart. He looked down at Ghost and scratched the dog behind his ears. The shepherd looked up at him, his old eyes full of a deep, unwavering loyalty. Elias had come to the mountains seeking to lose himself in the silence. Instead, a veteran canine had found an abandoned tank, and the letter inside had allowed Elias to find himself, to finally come home. The weight was gone. In its place was a quiet, earned peace. What we have witnessed here is more than just a story of a man and a dog and a relic of war. It is a testament to the quiet miracles that God places in our path when we are lost in the wilderness of our own making. Elias Thorne went into the mountains seeking an escape, but the Lord, in his infinite wisdom, provided not an escape, but a purpose. He sent a loyal creature, a ghost of a dog, to unearth a ghost of the past, not to haunt Elias, but to heal him. This story is a powerful reminder that our deepest wounds are often healed not by forgetting, but by facing a new calling to do what is right. It shows us that true strength is not the ability to leave the past behind, but the courage to stay and confront a new moral choice, to choose loyalty, to choose love, to choose honor, even at great personal cost. If you are watching this today while carrying the weight of a past silence, a private failure, or a secret regret, let this story be a beacon of hope for you. Know that redemption is not always a grand, dramatic event. More often, it is a quiet choice. It is the decision to protect, to serve, to speak truth, to honor the forgotten. It is the strength to choose your ghost over your mission when the moment of testing arrives. God's work is often done in these ordinary moments, through the quiet loyalty of an animal, the integrity of a public servant, the unexpected courage of a stranger. He does not always part the seas, but he will always provide a path through the wilderness if we have the faith to follow the unlikely guide he sends us. May the story of Elias and his incredible canine companion inspire you to look for the tanks buried in your own life, the forgotten injustices you have the power to correct, the quiet truths waiting to be told. May you find the strength to make the right choice, the corrective choice, and in doing so, find your own earned peace. May God bless you and keep you, and may He give you the courage not to run from your past, but to find your purpose in the present. Thank you for walking this path with us. Please share this story with someone who might need to hear it. Leave a comment about a time a second chance changed your life, and subscribe to our channel to continue being a part of this community of faith and fellowship.